I've been visiting with candidates who have contacted us wanting to come on the show while early voting is now wrapping up. Today's the final day of early voting here in the state of Texas. Election day just 4 days away. And joining us to talk about his campaign for the railroad commissioner, it is the Libertarian candidate, Mark Miller, joining us here on the Chad Hasty Show. And Mark, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Chad. I'm doing great.
Appreciate you coming on today. This is an interesting race because it really features not a Republican versus a Democrat, even though there is a Democrat in the race, but it's a Republican versus a Libertarian. And you two are getting the most publicity. You've earned a number of endorsements from newspapers around the state of Texas. Tell folks about yourself and why you decided to jump into this race.
Well, I ran for railroad commissioner in 2014 as well as a Libertarian, but I decided to run for railroad commissioner as I was getting involved in politics because of my background in oil and gas. I'm sure most of your listeners know that the Railroad Commission doesn't regulate railroads any longer. It did at one time. Its primary responsibilities are oil and gas industry. So having the long, extensive background as a petroleum engineer, I actually have a PhD in petroleum engineering. I've worked for over 40 years, and there's a lot I bring to the table.
On your website, you have railroad crossed out, and you have oil and gas put in there. I'm guessing that you're wanting to change the name of railroad commissioner to oil and gas commissioner?
Well, that's a little bit of a marketing ploy. The name I actually prefer is the one that the Texas Sunset Commission staff has recommended, which is Texas Energy Resources Commission. The reason I like that is because the Railroad Commission does have some responsibility for coal and uranium mining as well. So I think Energy Resources is probably the best name, the one that best informs voters about what the agency really does. But I am in favor of a name change, yes.
When people look at the difference between a Libertarian candidate and a Republican candidate, normally we're looking at right now the top of the ticket, the presidency, Libertarians versus Republicans versus Democrats. In this race, what is the big difference between yourself as a Libertarian and your main opponent as a Republican? What would you bring, I guess, philosophically to the table that he doesn't?
Well, the biggest thing, I think, is that I'm actually free market, and my Republican candidate is not. He openly, I heard him on your show the other day. I've talked to him other times. He thinks the Railroad Commission ought to be promoting oil and gas in the state of Texas. As a Libertarian, I'm a free market person. I don't believe government has any business promoting any industry, and so that's the biggest thing. The other thing is transparency. Mr. Christian does not want to change the name. He somehow thinks it's okay that 95% of the voters don't know what the Railroad Commission does, but I actually think we're lying to the voters when they don't know what they're voting for. A job that's on the ballot every 2 years. It regulates our state's most important industry. So those two things really do distinguish me from him quite clearly.
Well, let me ask you this. Would the voters know if they changed it to what the Sunset Advisory Committee came up with, would voters still then be educated as to what you guys would be doing? I mean,
not that alone. Not
okay.
that alone, of course. They would still need to do their research. But I can guarantee you, I talk to people all the time, and you tell them that the Railroad Commission doesn't do railroads, and they go, "What?"
Oh yeah.
And I think they would do more research. There's a lot of people in the state that love our oil and gas industry, as I do, and there are others who have some issues with it. And either way, you ought to be informed about who you're voting for.
Well, how do you think your relationship would be with the state legislature? I think that's one of the things that your opponent has brought up, is that he's got connections. He knows the legislature inside and out. What would you bring to the table on that front?
Well, first first of all, I a lot of common sense and working with folks. I've done that my whole life. I'll probably get crossways with the legislature from time to time. I know the legislature hasn't wanted to change the name. But if we think, people ought to knee-jerk do whatever one party wants in this state, I think that's bad for us. And so I think to have some alternative voices out there that are expressing some points of view that are rational and reasonable and looking out for all the people of Texas would be good for the state.
Do you worry, let's say Hillary Clinton wins, becomes the next president? Democrats forever have not been fond about oil and gas, especially here in the state of Texas. Do you fear, or do you have any thoughts about what would happen if if Hillary Clinton becomes president, what she and what the Democrats would impose on the state, and how, if you were elected railroad commissioner, how you would fight back and how the railroad commission would fight back?
Well, certainly, anytime the federal government intrudes on what we're doing here in Texas, that's a bad thing. And I'm a local control kind of guy, starting with the state. I think that our problems here in the state we ought to deal with, and so I certainly think we ought to push back when we get the EPA or any government agencies pushing into Texas business where it doesn't belong. On the other hand, I'm running for railroad commissioner, and its job is really to take care of what's going on in the state. And so I really believe the focus of the campaign, the focus of our discussion ought to be on what should our railroad commission be doing to help better regulate oil and gas in Texas. Fighting off the EPA is to me a kind of wag the dog kind of topic. It's important, but it's not the most important thing our railroad commission does.
You've been endorsed by a lot of the newspapers across the state of Texas. Every time we talk about newspaper endorsements, the candidate who doesn't get the endorsements say newspaper endorsements don't matter. It's not a big deal. Some of the newspapers endorse Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Those who do get the endorsement say, hey, it's a great deal. Look, people like me. What do you think won the editorial boards over to your side? Being a libertarian, I can't remember this many papers endorsing a libertarian before.
I don't think any of those papers have ever endorsed a libertarian.
Yeah, so
this is new territory.
What won them over to your side, in your opinion?
There were really two things. My qualifications were one of them. They obviously were impressed by my qualifications, but as you may know, I wrote a book about the Railroad Commission last fall as a way of laying out my policy prescriptions for regulating oil and gas in Texas, and they really thought I had a well-intentioned, well-thought-out set of policies for Texas. I think it was the Fort Worth Star-Telegram said that I have deep knowledge of oil and gas or something like that, but from a respectful distance. And I think that's correct. And they were impressed by my kind of middle-of-the-road ideas about what ought to happen with oil and gas in Texas.
You're at a disadvantage in this race because of how many people go straight party ticket. You know that.
Of course. That is exactly. There's two disadvantages. One of them is straight ticket voting, which about half of Texas voters typically do.
Right.
The other one is that people don't understand what the Railroad Commission does. So
right.
Part of my reason for running is to educate folks about the Railroad Commission, and I think maybe I've done a little bit of that, and that'll serve Texas well.
How do you get the message across to people who do go in, though, and they hit straight party ticket Republican and they walk out? Because, like you said, that's what a lot of people in the state do. Do you think you've been able to combat that with different groups that you've gone and spoken with? Do you think, obviously, while it puts you at a disadvantage, do you think there's been any movement as far as the people you've talked to get away from voting straight party ticket?
I think there has. The dissatisfaction with our national candidates, in all honesty, has kind of helped with that. I've had a number of Democrats and a number of Republicans both tell me they're voting for Trump or they're voting for Hillary, but they're voting for me. And so, that's kind of, we don't have any polling, so I don't know how many votes that'll turn into, but I've had a lot of people tell me that, and I've had a lot of interest in my campaign because I do believe it's kind of middle of the road and responsible. And so whether we'll be able to pull that off or not, I don't know. We'll find out on Tuesday.
Visiting with Mark Miller. He's candidate for Railroad Commissioner. You can visit his website, 4TX, that's Miller, number 4TX.com. And Mark, before we let you go, take the next minute, lay out the case why people should vote for you against your opponent.
I am a libertarian, and so one of our big roles is small government, as most people know, because small government means more liberty. But I also think government ought to be doing its primary responsibility, which is to protect our property and our rights. And I'm looking to make the Railroad Commission do that and do that alone. People should be assured, though, as a libertarian, I believe everybody has rights. Mineral owners have rights. Surface owners have rights. Oil companies that are drilling for oil and gas have rights. And so the Railroad Commissioner, I'll make sure that all of those rights are respected and that we'll have a Railroad Commission that the people of Texas can be proud of. So look for me at Miller for Texas, MILLER, the number 4, TX.com, and find out a whole lot more about my positions. There's a lot there, much more than any of the other candidates.
All right, Mark, appreciate your time today. We wish you luck, and we'll visit with you again in the future, I'm sure.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Chad.
Thank you. That's Mark Miller, Libertarian candidate for Railroad Commissioner.